Okay, so I've seen a lot of sites have to upgrade their PHP version and help them through that process. So this talk leans on a lot of that experience. If you want to connect with me on social media, I have my information here. And we'll also have a section for Q&A at the end. I'll be in the speakers lounge area if anyone wants to talk after as well, because I know we have other talks and things coming in right after. So today, first we're going to take a look at the PHP landscape, what versions are out there, who's using what, why they're using those versions. We'll look at PHP 7.2 and the benefits that that version offers. And then we'll get a brief introduction to Ansible as an automation tool and look at some example configurations for upgrading PHP versions with Ansible. And last, we'll talk about some considerations that you should take into account when upgrading PHP versions. It's not as simple as it sounds, even though you know it may just be installing a couple of packages on your server. There are a lot of other things that sites and websites and applications should consider before making the plunge. So we'll talk about that as well. So first off, what does it look like out there in the world of PHP today? Well, there's a lot of PHP 5 in use, and this has been the reality for a lot of years now. PHP 7.0 was released in late 2015, but still you can see even today in 2019, PHP 5 is still majorly the most common version to be used. And that may be surprising, but it gets even more surprising as you look at it over time because, like I said, PHP 7.0 was released in late 2015, but even looking at 2016 and on, PHP 5 had nearly 100% market share of all PHP versions, and it's really only in the last year that PHP 7 has gotten even up to a 25-30% market share of the PHP versions in use. So you can see that through the years, PHP 5 has been pretty much widely regarded as the stable version of PHP in use. So let's dive into the versions of PHP 5 that people are using. So we can see PHP 5.6 is the version most widely used. This one was released in 2014. And as we know, a lot of times what happens when we're developing apps is that you'll get a lot of development resources and you'll choose the stable version of PHP at the time when you're first starting a project. And then as you develop that application and you get to the end of that project, you suddenly don't have nearly as many development resources at the end to help maintain and update that code and add new features. And so whatever you chose at the beginning ends up being the version that you're just permanently on in a lot of cases. And as we also know, people tend to be resistant to change. They don't want to undertake the challenge of upgrading to a new major PHP version. And so that's why we see a lot of PHP 5.6 in the world. A lot of people, even though PHP 7 has been around for several years now, haven't been super eager to take the plunge and take that on. Oh, and while we're talking about it, if you're wondering where did PHP 6 go, it had been under development since 2005, but it was actually abandoned in 2010 because the talk around the water tank anyways was that it was going to support Unicode and UTF-8 natively in PHP. So it already had gotten a bad reputation as the PHP project that never got to completion. So there were other features of PHP that we wanted to release, but at the same time, they didn't want to call it PHP 6 because other expectations had been set for that. So PHP 5.6 was abandoned and never released. And instead, with this new version of PHP, they rebranded and gave it a new name, PHP 7.0, so as not to cause any confusion with the messaging that was already out there for PHP 6. So looking at PHP 7 versions in use, over the last year, you can see we've had some new versions of PHP 7 come out as well. So PHP 7.0 was in late 2015, and then each year after that, we've had a new minor version of PHP 7 come out as well. So as we had new minor versions come out, that's when people started to say, okay, it might be a little more stable and a little less risky to upgrade to a new major PHP version. Because I don't know about you guys, but when there's a new major software update, like for my iPhone, I never want to upgrade right when it's available. I'm like, let's wait for a couple minor patches first so they get the kinks worked out. It's a little less risky. They figured out what works and what doesn't. And so as that happened, PHP 7.2 rose in popularity, and so it's almost now about the same usage worldwide as PHP 7.0. And now we have PHP 7.3 out there as well. So you can see that PHP 7.2 is still gaining some traction, but we still have this to contend with. A lot of the PHP realm is still on PHP 5. So why use PHP 7, 7.1, 7.2 in that case? Well, first of all, the big concern is security. So if you look at this right now, PHP 7.2 and 7.3 are the only versions out there that are actually under active support. So they're the only ones being actively developed, actively adding features to them. And PHP 7.1 is still receiving security fixes. So that means if there's a vulnerability that's discovered, PHP 7.1 is going to get the back patch for that security fix. But in red here, PHP 5.5, 5.6, and 7.0, they're all end of life, and that's effective as of December of last year. So what that means is if there's a vulnerability discovered, you may be stuck with a vulnerable version of PHP if you haven't put the resources into upgrading to a newer PHP version. And that's not a good situation to be in, to have to choose either I'm sitting here with vulnerable code or I have to upgrade to a new major PHP version on the fly. That's really not a good boat to be in, especially considering this. There are millions and millions of sites out there on PHP 5.6, and those versions will be vulnerable as soon as the first vulnerability in PHP is found. So that's a really scary situation to be in. So it's definitely worth it to put the resources in up front and be ready for it now instead of having to wait for an emergency to come up. But beyond the scary stuff of security, there's also a lot to like about the speed that PHP 7 and higher offer. So like I said, when I was working in web hosting, we saw thousands of sites upgrade from PHP 5.6 to 7.0, 7.2, and we saw on average about a 30% decrease in PHP processing time for PHP 7 and higher sites. And that's pretty significant because that means that that's computational power that's now free to do other things on your server. So that means you can serve more concurrent requests, you can use less resources on your server in terms of memory, it'll be faster overall for your users. And as you can see, these are WordPress stats from Kinsta, but these show that with every new version of PHP 7.x that's been released, it's gotten progressively better and better. So there's a lot to like in terms of speed here and in terms of just your server costs, your computational costs in terms of serving PHP, and being able to support more concurrent users on your site at one time. So there's a lot of benefits when it comes to upgrading PHP, but it can be challenging. It can be really challenging. While yes, there are no major deprecations when it comes to PHP 7, and technically if you built your app specifically in the PHP 5 box, you should be able to move it to PHP 7 without any issues. That's a really hypothetical thing. The things that were warnings in PHP 5 are now fully deprecated in PHP 7, and there's a lot of functionality that you might be depending on your website that you now have to refactor in your code. On top of that, there's packages like Composer packages that you might be installing that are dependent on specific versions, and maybe they haven't released a compatibility patch with PHP 7 yet. Luckily, we've got a couple of years under our belt, a couple more stable versions of PHP 7 released to where anything that's being maintained properly will probably have a version that works with PHP 7. But again, that's developer resources, and that's things that cost time and money with businesses. So it can prove to be challenging. But my pitch today is basically, let's make it simpler by automating that process. So instead of just going on and logging onto your servers and saying, let's update, let's get those new PHP packages on there, you can simplify things a lot by creating an automated playbook with Ansible to manage those updates. So first of all, what is Ansible? It is a server and infrastructure management tool. It's a really great tool in terms of keeping your infrastructure up to date, and there's a lot of different ways that you can utilize it to the best of its abilities. I will preface by saying I had never touched Ansible code at all until September of last year, so I'm still really new at it. But by October of last year, I had been able to use Ansible to upgrade 13 of our apps at my company to PHP 7.2 from PHP 5.6. So it was a really easy tool for me to learn, and the logic behind it makes things very simple. So here's an example of a configuration that you could have with Ansible. You can use Ansible Tower, a Bastion server, or Ansible Pull to basically automate a lot of the infrastructure needs that you have. So you could create a server, you could assign IP addresses to it, you could add security rules, install packages, make sure that it passes quality tests, and you could even assign it to a pool of servers under a load balancer. There are a lot of things that Ansible can do in terms of communicating with your infrastructure provider or just automating the installation of packages and configuration files that you need to have in place for your application. So a lot of the reason that companies tend to use Ansible is for situations like disaster recovery. So if you there's this concept out there called cattle versus pets when it comes to servers. So if you treat your servers like pets, then you have several servers that you keep maybe for several years. And those servers you may log into, install a new package on, tweak the config file, and you're all doing all of this work manually. So you may have your code checked into Git and deploy it automatically with Git, but you're doing all of your server work manually. So treating them like pets, that's not a great situation for disaster recovery, because what if you woke up one morning and suddenly your servers were down and completely unrecoverable? How would you get back to a working state to have your site back up and running within a reasonable amount of time? Well, it's really hard if you're treating them like pets. But if you treat them like cattle, where you have a playbook and a sequence of events that's automated, you can create a new server from a template. You can run a series of tests that's known to work, that installs all of the required packages and all of the configuration files for your server setup, and have a server up and running within a few minutes. So instead of having a day or more of downtime if your servers were to go down, you could automate that process to replace that server within minutes. So cattle versus pets, I definitely prefer the cattle method, and Ansible can really help automate that process. Some people call it infrastructure as code. I call it infrastructure as YAML, because let's be real, it's all YAML. Ansible uses YAML, as many systems that DevOps tend to use YAML. It uses a series of modules, roles, playbooks, variables that can all be combined together to run tasks conditionally when you need them, run things based on environment variables, run roles and tasks based on situational variables. So you can get as specific or as simple as you need to with Ansible. So here's an example layout. In every conference, none of the code examples or actual project layouts that you see should ever actually be used. They're all examples, so I'll preface everything I say by that. So none of these are the actual production code that anyone that my company is working with is actually using, but these are just kind of to give you a basic idea of what it might look like. So at the top, you have your Ansible _ project name, and that's the top of your Git repo. Underneath that, you may have a provisioning folder, and within that, you have some environment variables or group variables. So for each environment that you have, whether it's develop, staging, production, local, demo, whatever types of environments that you can have a folder within there that contains all of the variables that are true or set to a specific value for that environment. So you could say env equals local or env equals dev to set things to true or false based on that variable. I know this is a lot of hypothetical stuff. I promise we'll actually dive into some examples in a second. And then below that, below your actual environment variables, you have roles. So then your roles, you can have role 1, role 2, role 3. I hope you don't name them that. Give them something that's actually useful, like PHP or database or something that tells you what's within them. The big thing to pay attention to within the roles is your tasks folder, and your main.yaml file within there will have the tasks that are run for that role. And every task can have conditional set to say, only run this task when this is true or that is true. You can also add handlers. So handlers are tasks that are run dependent on whether another task was changed. So Ansible has this concept called idempotence, which means that when its tasks are run, the end state will always be the same, right? So that's kind of a weird concept to understand, but let's give an example. A server config file like an Nginx config file. If I have a task that says I want to copy over my Nginx config file into place, Ansible will first check, is the file that I'm moving over equal to what's already there? And if it is already there and it looks exactly the same, Ansible won't actually have to do any task. It'll just say, okay, it's already good. If it does look different or that file's not there and Ansible actually has to perform an action, its status when you run that playbook will be changed. And if you've set a handler to say, notify restart Nginx, once that is done, then that means that at the end of your playbook, Ansible will then run the handler which says restart Nginx. And that's important because the config file changes that I've just put into place, I want Nginx to take account of those, and so restarting it will help it recognize those changes. So that's what the handlers folder is for, is to put in any tasks that should be run when other tasks are changed. And then you have a defaults folder. This is for default variables. So if you have a variable, for example, node version. If you have a node version variable, you might want to set a default version that none of your apps should go below, or none of your environments should go below. To say, let's say node 6.11 would be my default node version. And I could set that in my defaults folder. And then within each environment and within each app, I can say node version 11 to say that I specifically want this version for this environment or this application. So setting a default variable can help if you have some apps that have this variable and some apps that don't, to just make sure that you don't run into an issue of installing a wrong version or running into an error because a variable is not actually defined in an application. And then Ansible also has folders for files and templates. So files are like literal files that you copy straight over to a server exactly in the state that they are. And templates are Jinja-style templating formats that Ansible uses to copy over files that may contain variables. So, for example, I could have a php.ini file, and I could set variables for PHP based on the environment that I'm in. Maybe I have a memory limit that I want to be low on develop and staging, but I want it to be higher on production. I could say my memory limit as a variable set to 256 in develop and staging, and I could set it to 512 or 1024 in production. And that way, when I'm copying over my template, I have PHP version set in that template, and it copies over the correct version for the correct environment. So the Jinja templating formats are really handy when it comes to inserting variables based on the specific environment that you may be in. And then very last, you can see there's a series of playbooks, and these playbooks call upon the different roles that we've set higher up here. And you can also set conditionals on the roles as well. So you could say, run PHP only when it's the first run, or run PHP only when it's developed, for example. And then within there, you can also define more variables. Yo, dog, I heard you liked variables. So there's a lot that you can do in terms of automating processes and getting really complex in terms of your logic and execution for Ansible. So here's an example of some of the things that Ansible can do, some actual YAML. at the top, we have some variables. We're installing specific repos and RPMs. We've set these as a variable because, as you may know, installing various repos, those are going to be different based on your PHP version and your OS. So if I'm grabbing a URL from Remy, I want that to be populated based on the version of CentOS and PHP that I'm actually running. So I've populated this variable based on those. And then I'm telling the yum module from Ansible to install the URL that it's populated. I'm grabbing the key so that all of my packages are validated. And then I have a series of packages that I'm installing that are conditional to the CentOS version. So Ansible has a series of facts that it gathers about every environment that it's run against or every host that it's run against. So it automatically knows what operating system it's running on. So I can say, if my operating system is CentOS and my version is 7, I want to install these packages from these repos. And if not, or if it's on 6, for example, I can run these packages from these repos instead. And then we have an example of some handlers at the bottom here. So right here, we've got restart Nginx and restart PHP FPM based on a template variable. So the template module allows me to copy that Jinja template into place based on the variables that are set. And then if it is changed, if any of those files are actually changed, then and only then do we restart Nginx and PHP FPM. So that means I'm not arbitrarily restarting Nginx when nothing's changed, but I am restarting it in the case that it actually does need to recognize new things. You can also use it to manage databases. So this is really handy. You can use the MySQL_DB module, and this will help you import databases. You can create databases, drop databases. They also have a MySQL_user module that allows you to create users, give them permissions. And you can see here we're using variables for this too. And you might wonder, is it really the best idea to add your MySQL credentials as variables in Ansible? Well, you're right. That would be a very poor choice. You should not be storing those in plain text anywhere, but Ansible has a really good option called Ansible Vault, and that allows you to create a config file that defines those variables, but then when you save it, you encrypt it with a password so that when you check it into a repo, not just anybody can see those credentials. You can only see it if you unlock it with a password. And Ansible has a way to provide that password to it in a configuration file, which then allows you to use it as a variable with, again, not storing those credentials in plain text anywhere in YAML. So Ansible Vault is really handy for things that you should be keeping secure, like your keys, your passwords, anything that you don't want just anyone from the outside world to see. And then here's some examples of the ways that you can communicate with AWS. Ansible has a module called EC2 metadata facts, and so using this, you can gather all of the facts about the EC2 instance that you may be running on. It'll give you the instance ID, the region, the security groups, the elastic IPs that might be assigned to it. So you can gather all of the information about the host that you're on, and then use that information, those variables, to append it to the facts that Ansible knows about your system. So then you can use those in further tasks that are below in the playbook. So you can assign new elastic IPs, assign new egress rules. You can assign new security groups. You can assign it to a load balancer. So there's a lot that Ansible can do by just using its EC2 metadata facts and its various EC2 modules too, in terms of managing your actual infrastructure. But like I said, Ansible can be as simple or as complex as you really need it to be. So if you wanted to, you could just deploy your Ansible code to the server and run your playbook right there on the server without having to manage EC2 much with Ansible 2. So you don't necessarily have to have a Bastion server or Ansible Tower to help manage those things. You can keep it as basic as you need to as well by just installing packages and config files. So there's a lot to like about Ansible. It can be basic, it can be complex. You can use as many variables and combinations of variables as you need to in defining how to run different tasks. And that means that it can make upgrading your PHP versions pretty easy. Here's an example of the PHP 7 configurations that are similar to how we ended up upgrading PHP. So you've got to start by installing the proper repos. This looks just like the first example I gave you. So we're populating that based on two variables. One is the Ansible fax CentOS version, and the other one is the PHP underscore version variable that we're setting. So we can say PHP underscore version is PHP 7.2, for example. And then based on that, we grab the proper REMI and appel repos. And then we install a series of packages. So again, these may or may not be the packages that you need. The big one is PHP. But REMI has a series of repos called REMI-PHP 7.2, REMI-PHP 5.6, REMI-PHP 7.3. And all of the packages that it contains are compatible with the corresponding version of PHP that it's got there. So you can use your PHP version Ansible variable there too to say, whatever I have my PHP version defined to, that's what version we're going to be installing. So we've got PHP, Nginx is the one we pull from appel, and the rest of the ones that are actual PHP packages here, those are pulled from our REMI-PHP 7.2 repo in this case. And remember how I talked about the default variables that you can set? Well, that helped us out a lot here too, because that meant that we could merge this Ansible code in and promote it up through the branches, but set our default PHP version to PHP 5.6 so that all of the apps and environments that weren't yet on PHP 7.2 could still use that version, and they could still use this playbook without having any issues. And then once we've installed the proper packages, all that's really left to do is to configure PHP programmatically. So back to our example of PHP INI and our memory limit, we're using the Ansible template module to install the php.ini file from our Jinja template. We're populating the variables that are in there on the actual server itself. So if I had, what did I name it? PHP memory limit defined in one of my apps to 5.2, then, or 5.12 for example, then when it's copied over to the etc php.ini file, it would contain 512 megabytes here instead of this actual curly braces variable. So that seems pretty simple, but again, there are a lot of considerations to take into effect, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But you can see how using these environment variables made it really flexible for us to say, we're going to go one environment at a time. So first we were able to merge it into our develop branch, and working with our developers from there, we could say, here's the problems that we noticed when we ran our unit tests. Here's the things that we noticed might be broken when doing our regression testing, to identify any problems and then fix them, and then promote it onto staging, do the same series of tests and make sure that everything is ready to go before then finally upgrading production. So you have several test environments to make sure that everything is ready with PHP 7 before moving up. So that was really key. Luckily, at my company, they saw the end coming near for PHP 5.6, and they knew that this needed to be a priority. They didn't have the DevOps resources until I joined the company in the late summer, and so that was my first big project, was to take on the Ansible work of automating that upgrade to PHP 7. So our developers were really great and willing to work with me, and luckily we didn't have any major holdups. The biggest issue we ran into was with one app that was particularly legacy. It had been around for like 10 plus years and had 9,000 files worth of PHP code, and that one was a real pain to get through. But all in all, from end to end, from when I began writing the Ansible code and working with the developers on each of these apps, it took us 2 months to upgrade all 13 of those apps to PHP 7. And we did a couple of things in parallel as well. So the nice thing about using variables is that you can set other conditions to be true based on the presence of those variables. So for example, I was able to move our apps from using the Apache web server over to a combination of PHP, FPM, and Nginx at the same time. So because we knew that change was happening in parallel, I was able to set some handlers like this in this example. So instead of restarting HTTPD, we could say we're going to restart Nginx and PHP FPM if the PHP version is defined to anything other than PHP 5.6. So it allowed us to do some of those things in parallel as well. And why did we choose Nginx? Well, in particular, when it comes to concurrent processing of web requests and static pages, Nginx is a really fast web server. And so here's some of the examples of our processing time with Nginx after we had moved to that, to both Nginx, PHP FPM, and PHP 7.2. So in terms of just like a single page load on GTmetrix, it was about the same, a little bit of improvement on some of the apps. But in our real user monitoring services in Pingdom, that's where we saw a really big impact, some of them almost 100% faster. So it made a really big impact in terms of the end user experience. So we're pretty glad that we made that choice to move over at the same time. And here's just a quick example of how we ended up doing that. Like I said, none of this is actual production code, so don't copy it exactly as it is. But all you need to do first is to install the proper packages from the proper repos, and then copy over your config files and make sure your files and directories are in the right place. So we've got our Nginx config files going into place. We're creating a PHP FPM socket. We're restarting those services when any of these tasks are changed. And that made it pretty simple to upgrade just based on the presence of any value of PHP version other than PHP 5.6. So you may wonder, why not set it to if PHP version is equal to PHP 7.2? Well, we wanted to future-proof it because PHP 7.3 is already out, right? So if we set the PHP version next to PHP 7.3, we don't want these tasks to suddenly not work. So by setting it to PHP version anything but PHP 5.6, that allows us to continue to upgrade and still not have any issues. So last, let's talk considerations. There are some deprecations, there are some changed functions. I will say from the web hosting sphere and helping a lot of people through this process, especially with WordPress, it was these specifically removed extensions that people ran into a lot with the MySQL and MS SQL extensions. People had a lot of code that was using these deprecated things, and they had been deprecated for a while, all the way through PHP 5, but they were more like warnings first. And now with PHP 7, they're completely removed. And so that proved to be a big stumbling block for people, especially if they were just the app owners and not the developers, because that meant they were going to have to develop or commit to developing new functions with them instead. If you're using encryption strings with some of these older encryption functions and things like that, there has been a lot of updates in terms of encryption and decryption on servers. So those are some things to be aware of. In terms of refactoring your code, again, I'm not an expert when it comes to those things, but luckily I had a great team that was there to support me. And so from the infrastructure side and the developer side, we were able to work hand in hand on those things. And then
say about that, if you put your error reporting on full open, including deprecated warnings, you see everything that is not supported by PP7.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if you put your warnings to a higher level, you can see in the error logs things that are actually deprecated before you move to PHP 7 to give you a full view of what you might be running into. And if you are using PHP unit and writing unit tests for your code, you're probably also going to need to update your PHP unit version. If you're on PHP 5.6, you're likely using version 4 or 5. You'll have to upgrade to version 7 or 7 or 8, I think, to support PHP 7.2. And I would recommend 8 so that you're in compatibility for a little longer. You have until at the end of, I think it's 2021 to continue supporting that.
If you use it to Composer, at the moment you switch to the PP7, Composer will update the PP unit automatically.
That's good, yeah. So she was saying Composer will update your packages and things, PHP unit, to the version that's compatible automatically. with PHP unit, which is great. So that's the other thing to keep in mind is any other packages that you may be installing that are dependent on specific PHP versions. Just going through and making sure that your Composer packages are set to the right versions, that you're not locked into one that's not compatible with these newer PHP versions. Like I said, if you're using ones that are actively maintained, then most of the time these developers for these packages have made updates for compatibility with these newer versions, especially since the older versions of PHP are now at end of life. And then last, this is just my plug for Cattle Not Pets. It's a really great opportunity when you make a major change to your infrastructure to redeploy your infrastructure. So in addition to changing from Apache to Nginx and updating our PHP version from 5.6 to 7.2, we actually redeployed every piece of our infrastructure, over 100 servers, through that process in 2 months. And it was a really great way to see where there's holes in our existing provisioning processes for servers to say, you know, it looks like someone made this manual hack to make this work a couple years ago. Let's add that into the Ansible automation and provisioning process for servers too. And that'll just help bulk up your disaster recovery processes and make sure that if you're having any issues with servers, you can simply replace them without much issue. So that's my DevOps plug for that. Last, I wanted to open up to some Q&A. We've got about 6 minutes. Do you have some questions?
When you use a cluster as a way to update server 1 first, check it, and automatically update server 2?
Sorry, what was the first part of your question?
When you are running cluster,
Oh, yeah.
the cluster cannot go down, so is it possible to let the Ansible automatically wait before the first updates?
Yeah, so the question was, is there, if you're running a clustered solution where you have multiple web servers, is there a way to make Ansible wait to not update all servers at once, but to do one at a time? It does have the option to roll updates in waves, so you could potentially do that if you wanted to, especially if you're going to be restarting services. The other way that you could do it is to provision a new server and only add it to the load balancer when it's ready. So provision the server, but leave it out of the load balancer so it's not receiving any traffic until it's passed all your checks and balances with Ansible, and only then add it to the load balancer and allow it to start receiving traffic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the most issue if the first server, if the first fails,
Yeah.
take the second one.
Yes, that's a good point. So it's a good practice to say if this first one fails, don't update the second one. So that's a nice thing about, you know, using the checks and balances to say, like, if that update failed, it's not going to get added to the load balancer. We're not going to add any traffic to it, and we're not going to proceed on with the next one. But even if we did, even if we provisioned like 6 servers to go under a load balancer and every one of them failed, because it failed those checks, Ansible's not adding any active traffic to them.
Yeah, but if it fails on all the servers under the load balancer, websites goes down.
Right, but we're keeping the same existing servers there until they've passed checks and balances. So
My updates are in place.
yeah, if you do in-place ones, it becomes more tricky. So it does, like I said, there are lots of options. Ansible is a really great option to help wave through those if you need to. Go ahead.
Are there like recipes or examples for various software like Bacula or something to get that installed through Ansible?
So the question was, are there recipes to install, would you say Bacula? Bacula through Ansible? Ansible, for every module that it has very good documentation with examples of different things that you can install. I don't know specifically about Bacula.
Examples in general.
Yeah, I see a lot of examples out there on the web. So even if Ansible themselves doesn't have a recipe built out for you as an example, there's a lot of GitHub examples of a lot of this YAML code to help you out too.
You can also use Ansible Galaxy, which has a lot of packages for installing different kinds of. So there's a package for PHP, one for Apache, for Nginx,
Ansible
for
Galaxy.
Ansible Galaxy.
Ansible Galaxy is what he was saying, is that it has a lot of different packages for that. Yeah. Anyone else? Any questions? All right. Well, we have 3 minutes left back of your life. Thank you.